The desert was cruel at dusk, when the sun dipped behind jagged cliffs and shadows lengthened like claws reaching across the sand. The wind carried the cries of coyotes, sharp and hungry, circling like ghosts in the twilight. Their voices rose and fell, an eerie chorus that carried over the empty plains. Beneath that vast and merciless sky, a young woman lay helpless, her body trapped beneath the earth, buried to her neck by hands that meant only malice. Her lips were cracked, her face streaked with dirt and tears, and her eyes, white and glassy, flickered between the fading horizon and the circling predators who waited for night to fall. Her breaths were shallow, her throat parched beyond words, but her heart still clung to life. The cruelty that had placed her there was meant to silence her, to erase her existence in the most agonizing way possible. The men who had buried her thought the desert would finish what they started. They thought no one would find her. But fate, mysterious and unyielding, had other plans. A lone cowboy rode the desert trail, his stallion's hooves stirring small clouds of dust as he made his way home. He was a man of silence, weathered by the frontier and tempered by solitude. His wide-brimmed hat shielded his eyes, though the desert winds had long ago hardened his gaze. He rode not for company, not for glory, but simply because the trail was his only companion. Yet, beneath that hardened exterior, he carried a sense of justice that no amount of hardship could snuff out. He heard it first, the faint, desperate cry carried on the wind. A sound so broken and weak that most would have mistaken it for nothing at all. He reined in his horse, listening. Again, a hoarse rasp, barely louder than the stirring sand. His instincts pulled him off the trail, toward the fading voice, toward what most men would ignore out of fear or indifference. As he crested a small rise, his eyes caught a sight that twisted his gut, the pale shape of a face, barely visible above the earth. The woman's eyes caught his, a silent scream of pleading. The coyotes, emboldened by her weakness, lingered just beyond, their eyes glowing yellow in the dimming light. The cowboy swung down from his saddle without hesitation. He knew the desert's cruelty. He knew what it meant to be left for dead. With his bare hands, he fell to his knees and began to dig, clawing at the packed earth like a man possessed. His fingers tore on rocks, his nails split against roots, but he did not stop. The woman's shallow breaths urged him on, each one a fragile thread between life and death. The coyotes grew bolder, their circle tightening, their snarls closer. The cowboy's horse reared and snorted, kicking dust at the predators, buying him time. Still, he dug, sweat and blood mixing with the dirt. The desert tried to fight him, as if the ground itself wanted to keep its prisoner, but he would not yield. Every handful of earth tossed aside was a defiance against death. The woman whispered something, so faint he nearly missed it. A plea, a prayer. He didn't ask her name. Names could come later. Life first. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into heartbeats, he freed her shoulders, then her arms, pulling her trembling form from the grave her enemies had carved for her. She collapsed into his chest, too weak to hold herself upright. He lifted her easily, cradling her against him as if she were made of glass. The coyotes howled again, angry at their stolen meal. The cowboy met their eyes, his hand brushing the handle of his revolver, but he did not draw. Instead, he carried the woman to his horse, setting her gently in the saddle before mounting behind her. With a firm grip on the reins, he urged the animal forward, away from the haunting cries that echoed through the night. The desert tried to take her, but she had been rescued by hands that refused to let go. She had been buried, forgotten, discarded, but the cowboy, with nothing but grit and mercy, pulled her back from the edge. And though she could not yet speak, though her body trembled with exhaustion, she knew that as long as this stranger rode beside her, she was no longer alone against the wilderness. The horse carried them steadily through the dusk, its hooves striking a rhythm that echoed against the silent expanse. The desert was not forgiving to the weak, and every breath the woman took seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. She swayed against the cowboy, her head pressing faintly against his chest, her body limp as though the last scraps of strength had already been spent. He held her upright with one arm, guiding the reins with the other, his eyes scanning the horizon for shelter, for any sign of water, for anything that could keep her alive until dawn. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why someone had left her buried like that, a living sacrifice to the desert and the coyotes. But he knew cruelty when he saw it, and he knew the kind of men who would do such a thing. The West had plenty of them, men who hid their cowardice beneath violence, who thought a woman's cries could be swallowed by the sand. He had seen enough graves in his time to know that if he had been a few hours later, she would have been another nameless marker in the wilderness. Her breathing rattled, shallow and uneven. He pulled the canteen from his saddle and pressed it gently to her lips. At first the water slipped past, dribbling down her chin, but when a few drops touched her tongue, instinct made her drink. He tipped it carefully, letting her swallow in tiny sips, not daring to let her take too much at once. Her throat convulsed, her cracked lips working to accept the life she had been denied. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone that soothed spooked horses. She drank a little more, then coughed weakly, the sound so fragile it scraped against his heart. He drew the canteen back, letting her rest, though her trembling fingers brushed it as if to beg for more. "We'll get you to water soon," he said, even if he wasn't sure where. The desert stretched endless before him, but he trusted the land. He had traveled it long enough to know where the old wells lay hidden, where a creek might cut through a canyon, where abandoned waystations offered shelter. Tonight, the stars would have to guide him, and the weight of the woman against him would remind him why he couldn't stop until he found safety. The coyotes' cries faded behind them, swallowed by the distance, but he kept his revolver loose at his side all the same. Men were often worse than beasts, and the ones who had done this to her might not be far. The thought tightened his jaw. If they came looking to finish what they started, they'd find his bullets waiting. As the hours passed, the woman stirred faintly, her voice a rasp of broken syllables. Why help me?" she whispered, the words dragged from her with effort. He looked down at her, his weathered face unreadable in the moonlight. "Because you're alive," he said simply. Her eyes fluttered closed again, but a tear slipped down her dirt-streaked cheek, vanishing into the dust of her skin. He didn't press her for answers. She needed strength before she could give them. The trail led them toward a line of dark shapes rising against the horizon, low hills that promised shelter from the biting wind. Nestled between them, he knew, was a shallow spring he had used before. If the water hadn't dried up, it would be enough to save her. He urged the horse faster, every step a race against her. Failing breath. When they reached the spring, he slid from the saddle and caught her before she could slump from it. She was feather-light in his arms, her body too thin, too starved. He lowered her gently beside the trickle of water that glistened faintly under the moon. With cupped hands, he lifted some to her lips. She drank greedily this time, desperation taking over, though he stopped her after a few swallows. Too much, too fast, could kill as surely as thirst. He filled his canteen, letting her take small sips while he gathered what dry brush he could find. Soon a fire crackled, throwing warmth against the cold night air. He draped his coat around her shoulders, watching as she huddled closer to the flames, her body shivering violently as life struggled to return. Her eyes flicked toward him, wary even through exhaustion. "You don't need to be afraid," he said, tossing another branch onto the fire. "I'm not like the ones who did this to you." Her lips moved, as though forming words she could not force out. Then, with effort, she whispered, "They wanted me dead." He nodded, not pressing. The West was full of unfinished stories, of men and women fleeing shadows that clawed at their heels. Whatever her story was, he would hear it when she was ready. For now, survival was enough. He kept watch through the night, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the dark. The desert never truly slept. He heard the distant shuffle of coyotes, the wings of owls cutting through the air, the rustle of something moving across the rocks. But none dared approach the fire. Beside him, the woman drifted in and out of uneasy slumber, her face softening slightly, as though the nightmare that had bound her for hours was finally loosening its grip. When dawn came, painting the horizon in gold and crimson, he saddled the horse again. She was stronger than the night before, able to stand with his help, though her legs wobbled beneath her. He lifted her gently into the saddle and climbed up behind her, wrapping an arm firmly around her waist. The journey ahead would not be easy. He needed to get her to town, to a doctor, before infection or fever set in. As they rode, she began to speak, haltingly, her words scattered between breaths. She told him of a group of men who had cornered her family's wagon, of how they had taken her captive when her father tried to fight them. She told him of the days spent bound, the taunts and jeers, the cruelty that escalated until they decided to bury her alive for their amusement. Her voice cracked when she spoke of her father, and tears spilled down her cheeks. The cowboy listened in silence, his grip tightening on the reins. He had no family left himself, no one to mourn him if he were swallowed by the desert, but the thought of those men laughing while the earth swallowed her made a quiet rage burn in his chest. "You won't have to face them again," he said when she finished, his voice low but steady. "Not while I draw breath." The promise hung between them, simple and unshakable. She turned her face slightly, studying him through weary eyes. There was no bravado in his words, no empty vow, only the weight of a man who had seen too much death to let another innocent fall. The road stretched long, the days bleeding into one another. They camped beneath the stars, shared the last of his rations, and drank from streams hidden among the rocks. She grew stronger slowly, the color returning to her cheeks, her voice no longer the fragile rasp it had been. At night, when the firelight flickered across their faces, she began to ask about him, where he came from, why he wandered alone. He gave few answers, but enough. He told her of battles fought, of a homestead lost to raiders, of years spent drifting with nothing but his horse and the land to keep him company. He did not tell her of the scars he carried deep inside, the kind that no one could see, but she seemed to understand them all the same. Their silence became a kind of language, heavy with meaning. She no longer flinched when his hand steadied her, no longer kept her eyes downcast. Slowly, trust began to grow in the spaces where fear once lived. One evening, as the sun sank low, casting fire across the horizon, she turned to him and said softly, "You saved me when no one else would. I thought I was forgotten." He met her gaze, his own steady and unyielding. "Nobody deserves to be left for the Coyotes," he said. "Not while I'm still breathing." Her lips trembled into something that might have been the ghost of a smile, fragile but real. She looked back at the horizon, and for the first time since he found her, there was something in her eyes besides fear, something that looked a little like hope. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, rolling like a sea of dust and sagebrush under the pale glow of the rising sun. The cowboy kept his eyes forward, scanning the land with the patience of a man who knew danger could spring from any corner of the wilderness. The woman leaned against him, steadier now than when he had first dragged her from her grave in the sand, but she was still weak. Her breaths came easier, though, and every mile they put between themselves and the place where she'd been buried felt like one more mile clawed back from death. Days passed in that rhythm of travel, silence and short conversations scattered like stones in the stream of time. She learned to sit straighter in the saddle again, her hands once trembling but now holding the horn with some steadiness. He taught her how to sip water without wasting a drop, how to keep her eyes on the horizon to find landmarks, how to listen to the wind to sense changes in weather. She listened to everything, her hunger for survival matched only by her hunger to reclaim a sense of control. At night, under the stars, she would sometimes wake from her sleep with a sharp cry, her body trembling from nightmares of suffocating earth and coyote howls closing in. Each time, the cowboy would not speak, but he would throw another branch on the fire, sit upright, and let her know she was not alone. Sometimes she would whisper apologies for disturbing him, her voice cracked with shame, but he would shake his head slowly and murmur, "Ain't nothing to be sorry for." She would watch the firelight on his face then, seeing the scars that weren't carved into skin but written in the way his eyes never really rested. One evening, when the air carried the scent of rain though no clouds were in sight, she asked him, "Why do you ride alone?" He was sharpening his knife, the scrape of stone against metal filling the quiet. He didn't answer right away. Finally, without looking up, he said, "Because there's no one left to ride with." She waited, sensing more behind the words. When the silence stretched long, she asked softly, "Family?" "Gone," he said simply. "Raiders hit the homestead while I was away on a cattle drive. Came back to ashes." His voice was flat, but the pause afterward carried the weight of a man who had never stopped hearing the screams in his head. Her eyes stung, not just from his loss but because she knew now that grief was the same no matter who carried it. She reached out, hesitating before resting her dirt-stained fingers lightly on his sleeve. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave a slight nod, not pulling away, though his eyes stayed fixed on the knife. That small gesture, though, felt like more than any speech could have given her. It was permission to share silence, to share pain without needing to explain it. As the days grew warmer and the prairie grasses turned brittle under the sun, they came upon signs that others had passed not long before them. Tracks of horses, too many to be a simple traveling party. Campfire ashes still warm in one place, a broken whiskey bottle in another. He studied the tracks carefully, his jaw tightening. "They're riding heavy," he said at last. Her heart clenched. The men who, she couldn't finish, but he understood. "Could be," he said. "Wouldn't surprise me. Men that mean don't ride far before causing more trouble." Fear coiled in her chest, but when she looked at him, something steadied. His voice hadn't wavered, his hands hadn't shaken. He was the kind of man who met storms head-on instead of running from them. They pressed on, but the air grew heavier with the knowledge that they weren't just fleeing the desert anymore, they were being drawn closer to the very men who had left her to die. She wrestled with terror and rage in equal measure, her memories flashing sharp as blades. At night, by the fire, she would clench her fists until her nails dug crescents into her palms. One night, when the fire burned low and the coyotes sang far off, she spoke with a tremble in her voice. "If they come back, if we find them, I don't want to be afraid anymore." He studied her across the fire, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Fear keeps you alive," he said. "But there's a difference between being afraid and being broken by it. You've already proven you ain't broken." She swallowed hard. "Teach me, then." His brow furrowed. "Teach you what? To fight, to shoot, to make sure no one ever buries me again." Her voice cracked, but the resolve in her eyes burned steadier than the flames. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached beside him and lifted his revolver, heavy and worn from years of use. He set it on the ground between them, the firelight glinting off the barrel. "First lesson," he said. "Respect it. A gun don't care who it kills, but it'll do what you tell it if you're steady enough." Her hand trembled when she reached for it, the weight surprising her. He moved around the fire, kneeling beside her, his hands guiding hers gently but firmly. He showed her how to hold it, how to keep her grip strong but not stiff, how to breathe with the rhythm of her heartbeat. He drew a line in the dirt, setting a small tin can at its end. "Take your time," he told her. "A slow, steady shot beats a fast, wild one." She raised the revolver, her arms shaking under its weight. The first shot cracked through the night, kicking back hard into her hands and missing by a wide margin. She winced, but he only nodded. Again. She fired again, and again, each time steadier than the last. Finally, the can tumbled over with a sharp clang. She stared, stunned, then looked at him. His mouth twitched in the ghost of a smile. "You'll do," he said. That night, when she lay down to rest, she felt something different inside her. Not just fear, not just survival, but a flicker of power she had thought stolen forever. The next days passed with practice woven into survival. At each stop, he let her handle the revolver, correcting her grip, showing her how to reload, teaching her patience. She began to walk taller, her voice steadier, her laughter even escaping once or twice at his dry remarks. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it lit the shadows from his face in a way that made her chest ache. Their bond grew not from words but from small acts, the way he lifted her down gently from the horse, the way she shared the last piece of jerky with him without hesitation, the way they each leaned closer to the fire at night without needing to explain the comfort of nearness. But the world was not ready to let them rest. One evening, as the sky burned crimson and shadows stretched long, they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from the valley below. A settlement, small, only a handful of shacks and a saloon, stood in ruin. The cries of frightened children echoed faintly, the wails of women carried on the wind. He reined in the horse, his jaw tight. "They're here," he said grimly. Her heart pounded, her mouth dry. The men, the ones who had laughed while the desert swallowed her. She could almost hear their voices. He turned to her, his eyes sharp. "You don't have to face this. I can take you around. Get you safe." Her hand clenched around the revolver at her side. She shook her head, her voice low but fierce. "I won't run anymore." He studied her a long moment, then gave a single nod. They rode down together, the weight of justice heavy in the air,